So much for a Zarya Genji meta, huh? That didn't turn out the way we expected it to, but regardless, we still had a very interesting 2023 Overwatch League playoffs. If you missed any of the action and you're looking for a recap, you've come to the right place. Today we embark on what could be the final playoff journey as we know it. Here's a recap of all of the action in my honest review. Hangzhou Spark versus Atlanta Reign kicked us off, and it did not disappoint. In surprising fashion, the 1 seed and one of the most dominant teams this entire season ended up falling to the Hangzhou Spark in reverse sweep fashion, no less. The game basically started how you thought it would, with Atlanta Reign clearly having a foothold over their opposition. You'd expect no less from the mid-season Madness champions, but with all the pressure in the world, maybe not being all that prepared, and the Spark just having that mental resilience, they clawed their way back into this series slowly but surely. The reality is the Spark started pressuring the Atlanta backline big time. They were starting to overwhelm them between the big plays that Lynx and Monk were making and just hitting the go button. Gushue and Shy and Leave, they were constantly harassing Chio and Fielder, and they ended up looking uncharacteristically poor in this game. They could not get it going. They looked super dysfunctional, getting picked off first a lot, which is not something typical that you'd see from what was easily the most dominant backline this season. And without that stable presence for the Atlanta Reign, their game plan crumbled before their very eyes, and there was no coming back. They couldn't stop the bleeding, and they ended up getting stunned by an APAC team. The main difference maker that led to the Spark getting back into this series and eventually winning it had to do with some of their big-time playmakers waking up at the best possible time. For starters, Leave finally started to look a lot better. He got off to a really rough start in the series. Stalker was heavily outplaying him on the Tracer role, but then something awoke inside of him, and he looked like a totally different beast, connecting with big pulse bombs, finding big kill after big kill in the clutch moments. Shy also was outplaying Lip, who was arguably, in a lot of people's eyes, the MVP. That was absolutely massive. Shy Sojourn went crazy in this game, and he deservingly got player of the match. But most importantly, in most people's eyes, was Monk. Monk had perhaps his best performance of his entire career in this game. So right off the bat, Atlanta Reign get knocked down to the losers bracket. Now we go from an interesting matchup to a pretty boring one. The Dallas Fuel versus the Seoul Infernal. Seoul came into this tournament as arguably the worst team, and they showed exactly why with this performance. Dallas had their number right from the start, and the only thing you really need to know about this matchup is that Infernal were forcing Doomfist, and Dallas's game plan was very clear. Hashtag bully mag. Solo EMP him, hack him constantly, solo grab him, make his life a living nightmare, and just constantly focus him, and he had absolutely no answer. His team was crumbling at the seams by forcing this strategy, and Hanbin was able to take over, once again showing the world why he is a god-tier Zarya player. But more importantly, Sparkle played a team-oriented Sombra that really ruined any chance of that Doomfist comp doing any sort of work, so easy win for Dallas and very tragic loss for Seoul. Boston versus London. If you've watched any of these games recently between these two teams, then you probably understand how this one went. Literally the same exact way as any of the others. A 3-1 victory for Boston, where they're able to completely counteract the composition that London lives and dies by. The Orisa Bastion absolutely ruined them. Hadi had all the pressure in the world on him in the front line, and in other cases, Smurf, like the absolute Chad that he is, would claim yet another player of the match for his insane Orisa play. Best Orisa in the game, even in a different era. Don't at me. He walked straight past Hadi, right onto that back line alongside Decay, and they would destroy them over and over again, often waiting for Landon to pop window before popping an Orisa ult of his own. London made it close because they're a very scrappy team. Obviously, that's going to happen. They even won control at the start and got off to a good start, but unfortunately for them, again, Boston's composition just plays better overall, so they started to fall behind inevitably, and the Uprising never looked back. Closing out day one was Florida versus Houston, part 1. In a grand finals preview, as it turns out, these two ended up having yet another great game in their rivalry. And early on in this series, it went how a lot of their matchups have started in the past, with the Outlaws clearly having the upper hand. The main theme of the first map was Fearless in his Doomfist. The Outlaws were clearly well practiced on this specific composition, and the execution could not have been any better. Fearless was getting maximum value out of a hero that you don't see that too often out of, so good on him. He got a lot of environmental kills, and it was just all him in the kill feed. But then, from that point onward, the Florida Mayhem flipped the switch by doing what they do best, outflexing their opponents with counter picks. It was then that the Florida Mayhem turned their attention to Fearless. They knew how much value he was getting, so they snuffed that out immediately with lots of pressure using a poke composition with Bastion Sigma. Now, Sigma was seeing some playtime in Korean contenders, but not that consistently, so it was a bit of a surprise to a lot of people to see the Mayhem break out this composition for the rest of the series. But, needless to say, it went pretty well in their favor as they'd win the next 3 maps and the series. It was like a night and day difference. It was still a very competitive set overall, but anytime Florida broke out that Sigma Bastion comp, the Outlaws folded like a lawn chair. It started out with Florida winning Midtown somewhat easily, but then it seemed like the Outlaws were starting to adjust. The Mayhem stopped playing the Sigma comp again, Outlaws were back in control on New Junk City, and they even took the first 2 rounds of the map. But it was at this point that the turning point of the series would ultimately happen, in what seems to be a theme this season with New Junk City, which I am convinced is a cursed map pick. Florida decided to break out the Sigma composition once again, and the Outlaws would end up dropping 3 maps in a row to get reverse swept on New Junk City, and it was right there and then that you knew they were absolutely boomed, and that they stood no chance of making a comeback. On day 2, the surprises would continue with the Atlanta Reign, as they'd end up losing once again in their group to be eliminated in the first round of the playoffs as a 1 seed, as the mid-season Madness champions, and with the best record in the entire Overwatch League. And it came to the London Spitfire of all teams, the funny Rhine team, just a bunch of lads playing their funny little Rhine Rush composition. A team like London or the Spark, they should be beating in their sleep usually, with the kind of talent they have, with MVP level players across the board, with 4 role stars on their team, and the Rookie of the Year. And this is what they have to show for it. Absolutely nothing. They got $0 in prize winnings from this, and they were the first team eliminated in the playoffs. It started with, once again, Fielder and Chio consistently getting picked off first, which is just something you don't see that often, and once again, without that stable backline presence, the Reign really didn't stand a chance, and from there, you knew the series was over. Desperation was in the air. They took Donghack out, who was consistently getting exposed as just a Winston player for the most part, and they put in Hawk to play the Doomfist instead. More of a veteran on that hero, more of a veteran in general, and to be honest with you, he looked like the only guy that showed up to play, both in Map 2 and in Map 3. He was the only guy doing much of anything, finding the big plays, getting big picks when his team needed him to, playing smart, playing safe. It felt like he was the only guy out there that truly wanted to win, which is quite ironic considering how weird the fit of Hawk on a Korean team is. It was just Hottie and the boys doing whatever they wanted to. Atlanta Reign were totally boomed, and London took advantage of that. If you're not in the right mindset, they will crush you every day of the week, as we've seen time after time. And now they've successfully pulled off perhaps the biggest disappointment in a playoff run we've ever seen, maybe even eclipsing the 2018 NYXL. It's the worst we've seen since then. 1 seeds like this don't lose very often, and this is quite honestly a shameful performance that nobody is going to ever forget, and it will truly affect the legacy of a lot of these players. Next we go yet again to a boring matchup, Seoul Infernal being the halftime entertainment, so to speak, as they'd end up being the Houston Outlaws punching bag in this one, in a similar fashion to the Dallas Fuel, not to the same extent, not quite as extreme, but still a 3-0 nonetheless. Seoul Infernal definitely showed some greater signs of life, as they stopped messing around with the Doomfist, and they played more of a comfort pick with Mag in his Wrecking Ball, and we saw some decent results. There were some good pop-offs from all their guys, they looked a lot more alive, they got some big-time plays out of MN3, even tried to do some Hail Mary Widow stuff on Ilios Lighthouse. It was a good effort all around, they tried their best, but the Houston Outlaws were clearly a much better team, and more importantly from the Outlaws, they showed some big-time adjustments that would end up paving the way to a grand finals appearance for them. They saw what happened in that Florida game and how strong the Sigma composition is, and they took it for themselves. They put Bernard in there, and he looked amazing. Honestly, one of the better performers for the Houston Outlaws this entire playoff run. Bernard, the late season signing who came in on short-term notice, really put in the work and had some amazing moments. This game most certainly included. Hangzhou Spark versus Boston Uprising. Surely the Spark are going to lose this time, right? Surely they couldn't possibly win in reverse sweep fashion again, right? Well, that's what happened. It started with the Spark once again getting off to a very slow start. But then we go to Saravasa, and once again, the Spark players flipped the switch. Leave, Monk, and Lenksa went absolutely bananas. The real hero of this one was surely Leave though, as he put up an MVP level performance that made it seem like he turned back the clock to 2021 with that Tracer. He was running circles around Decay with some of these huge pop-offs, landing every pulse bomb at the biggest moment possible, and then he really was the closer, so to speak, on Route 66. Boston Uprising seemed like they had a chance to maybe capture point B, but he put an end to that real fast by constantly just nagging that entire team, getting kill after kill after kill, having some super big clutches to help stop that payload at 0.01 meters. But the brains behind it was surely Monk and Lenksa. Twilight was nowhere to be seen, fans were throwing a riot, and it's easy to see why. Izayaki was getting outplayed by Monk, something that should never happen. Monk really figured something out with those defensive nades. Decay was getting no value out of Genji or Tracer or any of that stuff. It was super easy for him to get a read on what he wanted to do. He'd save those cooldowns right for when Decay came from him, and it was easy money from there. But also Lenksa did a crazy job of keeping Monk alive, and vice versa. They were the unkillable backline, honestly feeling like Fielder and Chio in their primes. And if Boston's backline can't compete with the Sparks, then you already know that they just could not come back from this series. They almost mounted a comeback on Route 66 with a solid point A defense, but it just wasn't meant to be, as the Spark claimed yet another victim and ended up claiming a spot in the Final Four, giving us some of the only APAC representation that we'd honestly see throughout the entire week. Florida versus Dallas. While this is an intriguing matchup on paper, seeing two superstar level tank players go at each other, the result left a lot to be desired. At first it seemed like Dallas might be able to walk right by Florida Sigma comp and find some big value with the Zarya, Hanbin constantly being high charge. But Florida figured them out super quick, not even one round into Lijiang Tower, and the rest was history. Although credit goes where it's due to the Dallas Fuel, as they did try and make some adjustments to keep pace with the Florida Mayhem. They gave up on the Zarya composition eventually, and they started playing a Sigma of their own. And needless to say, the results got a lot better for them with Hanbin just being that guy on that hero. He always has been. He honestly looked better than someone in some scenarios despite having a worse team, but the swaps came a little too late, and Florida are just the superior team, so they were able to take King's Row and then simply counterpick around that Hanbin Sigma by playing the rush comp, and Dallas folded. It seems that the Mickey Mouse Zarya championship run was not meant to be after all. I'll admit it, I was wrong. I thought Zarya was going to be meta, but it seems that it's pretty easily countered, and Dallas paid the price for it, along with having a much weaker team than the Mayhem. Boston versus London, losers final. Remember what we talked about for London versus Boston the first time? Well, this game was a rinse and repeat. A 3-1 for the Boston Uprising, where Smurf could do whatever he wanted on that Orisa comp. It did feel like this matchup was slightly closer than the last one, with London trying to make adjustments and generally showing more of a fighting spirit, but in the end, Boston ended the series just how they have basically every time they've played the Spitfire, in heartbreaking fashion, tearing that heart straight out of the London fanbase by taking the lead at the last moment on Esperanza just when it seems like London might have it. Regardless though, London should feel very proud of what they did this season. They started off 2-8 and almost made the Final Four. It really does not get much better than that. But also congrats to Boston on the other hand, who now were able to get their highest finish in the history of their franchise. Houston versus Dallas. The Outlaws perhaps ended the Battle of Texas as we know it the way that it started, by absolutely blowing out the Dallas Fuel in spectacular fashion. Once again, the Outlaws showed some great presence with that Sigma composition. Every time it seemed like the Dallas Fuel were starting to turn things, they were able to find some great plays from Bernard, as well as Pelican in his incredible Echo. That was honestly the main difference maker. At times this series did feel super close, and like Dallas actually had a chance of taking maps, or at least prolonging them, but anytime it seemed like it was in doubt, it was Bernard and Pelican who would ruin them. Hanbin certainly tried his best on the Junker Queen, and he also got a good effort out of Sparkle on the Symmetra, and maybe in one last hurrah for the Element Mystic boys, but it just was not meant to be. The Outlaws were a far stronger team. Their teamwork was a lot better, and it felt like they got a more well-rounded performance out of their guys, as MCD and Bliss simply could not keep up with the veteran presence of Shu and Violet. Boston versus Florida. This rivalry continues to deliver with yet another banger. It's unfortunate this one couldn't go to 5 maps, because it sure as hell already felt like we were at that point, with how intense and back and forth this series would end up being. At first it seemed like it may not be much of a contest, as the Florida Mayhem started off in dominant fashion on Busan. It seemed like their execution was a million times better, their team play was undefeated, Checkmate's May was going absolutely crazy, the wall placements were perfect, and it felt like no Florida player could ever die, even though they had every right to. But Boston didn't give up, they didn't back down, and they stuck to their guns. They were convinced their Junker Queen strategy was an answer to what Florida was running, and for a while it seemed like they might be onto something. On Midtown, they had a flawless first point attack, and that was able to set them up for a close victory with a stout defense later on. The big thing was, maybe perhaps with more open space and adjusting their game plan, Decay was able to really get it going on that Genji, find some more value by tackling those squishies, and even looking good with the blade, which is a rare occurrence with Genji, especially against a composition like Florida's. But then things got very interesting in the final 2 maps of this series as Florida were able to close it out. On New Junk City, we had perhaps one of the most wild games of counter swaps in the history of professional Overwatch. With every new fight felt like a swap between the 2 tanks. Someone and Smurf were constantly trying to outdo each other with this game of rock, paper, scissors, so to speak. It starts off how Midtown ended, with Boston walking right by Florida's poke composition. Immediately after losing first point, Florida say, we're just gonna play the Rhine then. But in response, before the next fight on point even begins, Boston make the executive decision to play Orisa, something that has worked very well for them against these Reinhardt compositions. And the counter swap pays off. Boston win the first fight. So Florida say, you know what? We're gonna boast our flexibility all over you. We're going back to the Sigma. Afterwards, the counter picks just keep on going. Boston go back to Junker Queen. They win a fight. Florida say, we're gonna play Orisa now. They win a fight. Boston decide to play Orisa of their own after that. They start winning a fight, so then Florida go back to the Sigma again. In total, there was like a solid 8 tank swaps between the 2 players, along with some minor stuff from both sides' DPS. It was like the ultimate rock, paper, scissors that you'd see in any sort of comp match, alongside the DPS playing outside of their minds. It was a magnificent sight to behold, but in the end, it seemed that Florida's backline was once again getting the advantage. Lee Jae-gon's timings just weren't as good as Chorong, and Florida were the more versatile team, better at making those mid-game adjustments, leading to that round win, and closing it out on Caliseo, where things admittedly were once again uncomfortably close. Birdring tried to do his best Hydron impression to catch them off guard with some flanking Soldier, just to play some Sojourn later on and find some crazy clutch kills that almost turned this series in their favor in the end. Decay was still going crazy on the Genji, but Boston unfortunately just could not string together consecutive fight wins when they needed to. Florida's execution was always a bit cleaner. That was the main difference. Boston were getting good production out of a couple of their guys, but Florida were firing on all cylinders, and it is a team game. game. If you're going to fall behind Florida in one or even two aspects, you're just not going to beat them. Smurf couldn't find the clutch ults when he needed to, Checkmate did a great job with the May, and Boston's support line once again fell behind Chorong and RuPaul as they were able to seize the day and punch their tickets to the Grand Finals for the first time. And joining Florida in the Grand Finals would of course be the Houston Outlaws, who got a convincing victory over the Hangzhou Spark. Sorry Spark faithful, but eventually your luck had to run out, and the Houston Outlaws were a non-fraudulent team that had to cross your path at some point. It wasn't going to be easy to defeat them. You had the power of friendship and whatnot in some really clutch performances, but you weren't going to get away with having Monk and Lanksa totally dominate against the likes of Shu and Violet. Not to mention, and more importantly of course, is the fact that Houston had a composition that completely counteracted the Sparks game plan of that dive composition. I mean, Houston themselves learned the hard way that the dive wasn't as good as the Sigma comp against the Mayhem. They copied their homework, so to speak, and the Spark had absolutely no answer. They couldn't kill any random squishies like we saw against Atlanta or Boston. Those miracle picks from Leave and Shy just weren't coming in as often. It was so hard to get those guys to not be all together at once in this death ball setup, so to speak, where they're all nice and healthy constantly, along with the immortality field. It was just virtually impossible for the Spark to find value. They even tried to throw a random Life Weaver their way, didn't really do much, and we ended up seeing the Spark crumble before our very eyes, with the only exception being King's Row. This map appeared to be a potential turning point in the series, even though the Outlaws got off to a strong start, finishing the map. It was after that that the Spark started to show some signs of life. Shy and Leave finally turned up and looked like their old selves, and Lanksa also played an interesting mind game battle with Violet, breaking out that Zenyatta, getting him to ego duel him, so to speak, on it, finding some random picks on him. I don't know how Lanksa, of all people, managed to do it, but it did feel like he was maybe getting in Violet's head a little bit. Eventually, the Outlaws would adjust, but it wouldn't come until extra rounds, because again, Shy, Leave, and Lanksa, that combination went absolutely crazy, and the Spark ended up finishing with even more time than the Outlaws, let alone finishing the map at all. But it was after that that the Outlaws would buckle down. Their attack was obviously great the first time, and that just continued onward past that. Happy and Pelican had themselves a map. There was nothing they could do wrong, and more importantly, their support line just started to outplay Monk and Lanksa, like you'd expect. And again, the Spark just did not have the answer because of that dive comp. It's just weaker than what the Outlaws are running, better fundamental Overwatch overall, and that led to the Spark's downfall. There would be no reverse sweep to be had this time, as they get 3-0'd on Suravasa, and their journey would end there. Spark versus Uprising, third place match. Yeah. This is a thing. Because of the format that we're using this year, there's no lower bracket finals to decide that top three. Instead, this is how it had to be settled, after these teams had the pleasure of getting defeated by other teams to make the grand finals. So, there really wasn't much to look forward to. It was a meaningless game aside from money, and if you didn't know this was a thing, and you missed out, don't feel like that, because you really didn't miss much. It might as well not exist with how boring and how meaningless this truly was. It just felt like the grand finals waiting room more than anything else. It was a quick and easy 3-0 for the Spark, with Boston looking completely lifeless after losing that game to the Mayhem. You really can't blame them. No one really enjoyed this game, and the only real winners are the Spark because they get more prize money. About 100k more to be exact, but to the Boston players clearly did not mean that much. Monk absolutely dominated them, and that was that. Florida Mayhem versus Houston Outlaws, Grand Finals. This is it. The moment that we've been waiting for. Florida versus Houston, the promised Grand Finals heading into these playoffs, and unfortunately, it kind of disappointed. In typical Overwatch League Grand Finals fashion, we got a snoozer of a game in terms of a scoreline, as the Mayhem cruised by the Outlaws with a 4-0 victory to hoist up their first ever Overwatch League trophy. The game wasn't particularly close. At first, it seemed like it might be, as the Houston Outlaws got off to a pretty hot start on Antarctic Peninsula. They took the first map with relative ease, and then on the second round, they went up 87% to 0 before the Florida Mayhem were finally able to accrue some point progress. And it was after this that the game's script completely changed. It's like the Florida Mayhem downloaded the Outlaws DLC or something. They pretty much never looked back for the rest of the series. By the end of this map, it went the exact opposite way, with Florida blowing out the Outlaws. And the main theme that would come into place that would eventually end up being a main theme throughout the whole series was merit. This guy was finding huge pick after huge pick to start fights on that sojourn. This guy came ready to play. He was ready to get that championship and enact revenge on the team that traded him away in favor of Happy. How many times did this guy find picks on the back line randomly? It was absurd, both on this first map and for the entirety of the set. On Blizzard World in particular, it was the merit show. His fingerprints were all over that one, finding huge kill after huge kill with the overclock, 2Ks, 3Ks, 4Ks, everywhere you looked, as the Mayhem were able to push through every point of progress with ease and have a stout defense at the end. And it was these first two maps, along with the rest of the heroics that he showed off, that gave Merritt the pleasure of winning Grand Finals MVP. It was well-deserved, he was locked in right from the start, but he couldn't have done it alone. The Mayhem in the second half of that series, they all started to turn up. Again, just stronger execution than their opposition, doing a great job of kiting those Houston ultimates, playing a very patient and reserved game, always waiting for the correct moment to strike. RuPaul's min-maxing on the Baptiste was absolutely out of this world. The immortality fields always came in clutch. And someone, once again, was a driving force on that Sigma. The final two maps of that set, he played some excellent Overwatch. Bernard was playing super well for as long as he could, but unfortunately, someone was just more ready for primetime, as well as that Florida support line. Out of all places for the Outlaws to get outplayed, I don't know if anybody had Shu and Violet getting outplayed on their bingo books, because that's exactly what happened. RuPaul outplayed both Shu and Violet on Baptiste in this series, which is not something that you'd ever expect just knowing the stature of these two legends. Florida were constantly winning the mirror and also at the same time making counter swaps when necessary, just as they've done this entire year. That's always been the big strong point of this Florida team. They can execute with such a high number of compositions. They're way more flexible than anybody else around them. They can outplay you just with that alone. They don't even need to have as many star players as some of these other rosters. And it got to the point where the Outlaws were completely overwhelmed, and going down 3-0, we all knew that this game was all over. And I don't just mean that because of the scoreline, also because the Outlaws, in a sheer act of desperation, subbed in Fearless. The anime protagonist came in to try and get one more Grand Finals magic run going, alongside their patented Tracer Sombra dive that made them so good to begin with this year, but unfortunately those roots just could not compete with what the Mayhem were playing. The stronger overall composition, the better overall team, the better general overall execution led the way to the Mayhem winning this map and closing out the series in some of the most dominant fashion and some of the most brilliant Overwatch that we've seen from an Overwatch League team since the 2021 Shanghai Dragons. This map was certainly close, just like some of the others were, but once again, Florida just came in more clutch and showed why they were the best team coming into this event. They may not have the number of marquee superstar carries as some of these other rosters, but they make up for it with a very well-rounded approach. Every member of this team can hurt you, as they showed time and time again, and along with the flexibility and their amazing understanding of the game, they put up some of the best Overwatch I have ever seen. It was magnificent watching this team cruise through the finals. It's disappointing to not have a closer finals than this, but we can say without a shadow of a doubt that the Mayhem 100% earned this trophy. Congrats to the Mayhem on first place. They finally completed the goal that the Overwatch League has been waiting for. The cycle of misery can officially end. The bottom 4 teams in the 2018 Overwatch League standings have now all won a ring. And that's going to do it for the recap. If you want my general opinion on how these playoffs went, in all honesty, they were my least favorite. It's not to say that they were bad, I just feel like it didn't deliver the same way as a lot of the other playoffs did. The atmosphere was really good, the crowd was amazing in Toronto, not to mention that the meta was super interesting. We ended up not getting like any Zarya outside of Dallas, let alone a lot of Genji, but in return we got a very diverse meta where it felt like every team could play something that played up to their strengths. Everybody had their own individual identity, which is something I can appreciate. If you look at the past, most Overwatch League metas have been very stagnant, so that's a super cool change of pace. However, there's a lot of downs that come with this playoff as well. For starters, the bracket in the system was super scuffed. Not having double elimination in the semis was absolutely cringe, and this whole group thing also didn't make any sense. They tried a bit too hard with that, and it led to some really weird scenarios like the third place match, for example. But on top of it, there weren't that many interesting storylines this go around. Honestly, the Spark and Rain kind of deadlifted this thing. The Spark had some of the only close games of the entire tournament, and if it weren't for their reverse sweeps and their Miracle Run, we wouldn't have all that much to talk about, alongside the Atlanta Reign doing absolutely nothing and for some reason sucking. The only other thing we really had was the Florida Mayhem and their dominance, but you can only praise that so much because of how unclose a lot of those games were. And maybe it's just because we know the end of the road is right in front of us, but it did kind of put a sour note on some of these playoffs. There are a lot of moments where the emotions were running high, good and bad, but there was always uneasiness just knowing that we only potentially have a couple days left together. And that tribute video at the end and the emotional speech by Zoe kind of put an exclamation mark on that. The journey looks like it is about to end. We don't know what's going to be in store for us in the future with our lives, with the Overwatch League, what it's going to look like moving forward in our esports scene. But one thing we can say with certainty is that this league was super special and that these playoffs had their moments. Can't complain too much, we got a new champion after all, and a lot of teams that haven't been that relevant throughout the years had some time to shine. And if that isn't a great way to end this league, then I don't know what is. The road ahead is unclear, but if there's one thing I want all of you to walk away from these playoffs, it's that the Overwatch League is an amazing thing that brought us all together, and it'll live in our hearts for the rest of time. More videos to come soon, by the way. I'll see you next time.